Good morning, class. I sort of approached you with a heavy heart this morning because of the horrible events of the last week and the riots and such, but I'm going to go ahead and focus on the lesson regardless. Today is June the 1st, and we're going to finish up talking about Persia with the Zoroaster. We spoke about him in the last class. We're going to finish up on Zoroaster, and then we're going to deal with Cyrus II, Nebuchadnezzar, and Daious the Great. And we're going to talk a little bit about the children of Israel. Because what's interesting about this period is that a lot of it, or the historical record, actually overlaps with the Bible. And we're going to go into some detail about that too. Okay? Now, we left off talking about Zoroaster, who had this new religion called Zoroasterism, and for details of that you could check our last lecture as well as the links in the previous class to some of the teachings of this Zoroaster. But the basics of this are discussed in your text on page 133, going into 134, and essentially he lived around 1000 BC or so BC, around modern day Iran and such, and essentially it goes like this. He was another one of these individuals, sort of like Amenhotep, who was tired of monotheism, polytheism, and he felt that there was only one true God. And as we discussed in the last class, he believed that there was this good God named Ahura Mazda, who was the god of goodness and wisdom and so forth, where he was against this person called Ahriman, who was the prince of darkness and evil, and that man had to follow Ahriman and his teachings in this book called the Gathas, which are excerpted in your reader, as we discussed in the last class. And this became the major religion throughout the Persian Empire, and many Persian kings that followed this. Now, at the same time, as we'll discuss in detail at the end of this lecture, the Israelites were doing their own thing with the Hebrew faith, which we know today is Judaism. And as just about all of you know, Judaism is the foundation of modern day Christianity. But that'll come at the end of this near the end of this lecture. Now, first off, we're going to talk a little bit about Persia and a couple of interesting kings that they had there. You see, to back up a little bit, one of the last major kings of the Babylonian Empire was a guy that some of you might be familiar with in the biblical teachings. You might have heard of Nebuchadnezzar II. Most of you know Nebuchadnezzar as that evil, arrogant king that enslaved the Hebrews. And at one point, he had the Hebrew children, and here's the story about that, for those of you who need a little bit of refreshing. It's in the book of Daniel, in the 3rd and 4th chapters. Talks about how Nebuchadnezzar had this huge statue raised of himself, and wanted everybody to bow down to it, except for the 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And as they refused to bow down to it, he had them put into the fiery furnace. And so the biblical account goes in the book of Daniel, I believe in the 3rd and 4th chapters, the angel led them out of that fiery furnace, and as punishment for his wickedness, Nebuchadnezzar was struck mad. He was insane before he repented of his evil ways. And that's, I believe, in the book of Daniel in the 4th chapter. But anyway, getting back to the story, Nebuchadnezzar had the Hebrew people enslaved in ancient Babylon. And pretty soon there came this really good king of Persia by the name of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great, by the way, is not only mentioned in the historical accounts, he's also mentioned in the Bible. You may want to take this down. The book of Ezra, the 1st chapter, 1 to the 8th verse, goes into detail about this good king Cyrus the Great. But for the historical record, he was born around 608 BC and died around 529 BC. And Cyrus the Great was was said to be by the Greek father of history, Herodotus, to be the grandson of this major king of Persia, and rebelled against his grandfather when he was a young man. So he went on to conquer much of Asia Minor and Babylon over the period of time, and was a great administrator. He was one of those kings that was like what I told you about Tutmos III earlier. Cyrus the Great was such a good ruler that when he conquered other kingdoms, the other kingdoms would defect to his side because they would rather his good rule than that over some of the evil people who they fought under. You see, these wise kings kind of learn from each other. It's a good thing, see? So anyway, Cyrus II became beloved by the Hebrew people because once he conquered Babylon and Persia and all of this, he liberated the Hebrew children. He freed the Jews. And that's why he's considered one of the main reasons why he is such a great leader in history. However, he literally went down with the ship. In other words, he died on the battlefield in his conquests, okay? So he was followed by a man by the name of King Daious I. Daious I, however, suppressed revolts going on all around him and such, and he had these huge rock statues made to him. And he was also quite the conqueror. And in the last class, I mentioned an interesting rock relief in Persia called the Byzantine inscription. Hey, I might be pronouncing that wrong. I'm going to tell you flat out. Which basically was one of those things that was sort of like the Rosetta Stone, where it had these various languages in which they were transcribed and so forth. It is found on page 135 of your text and discovered by Henry Rawlinson, the British archaeologist, in about 1835 or so. Okay, and it was carved in Old Persian, Akkadian, and Elamite, and that is the reason why today we know how to read cuneiform, is because Henry Rawlinson cracked the code for all this. But anyway, Daious had this inscripted on what's known as these Byzantine inscriptions. He went, "Saith Daious the king, these 9 kings I took, full prisoner with the battles. Saith Daious the king, these are the provinces that became rebellious. The lie made them rebellious, so that these men deceived the people. Afterwards, Ahura Mazda," that's the god of Zoroastrianism, "put them into my hand, as was my desire, and I did unto them. Saith Daious the king, thou who shalt be king thereafter, protect thyself vigorously from the lie. The man who shall be a lie follower, him do thou punish well. If thou shalt think, may my country be secure." In other words, he's saying that to follow him would be to follow the truth of the god Ahura Mazda, and the lie would be to oppose him. Well, Houston, we have a problem here, because as it turned out, Darius kind of overplayed his hand around 492 BC. You see, he tried to conquer these the city-states of Sparta and Athens through a naval battle, but he was unsuccessful, and so that was the beginning of his end. However, the Spartan and Athens city-states would soon merge into what we know today as the civilization of ancient Greece. And we're going to talk about ancient Greece a bit sometime next week in these lectures. But for right now, now that we're done dealing with Persia and Cyrus, as well as Darius I, also known as Darius the Great, we move on your text on to page 143, where it talks about this interesting group of people known as the Israelites. So in lower Lebanon, around upper parts of Egypt and so forth, they gathered this group of people who were captive in ancient Egypt for a considerable period of time, and they decided that they were not going to follow the polytheistic gods. They were going to follow the one true God, who is known as Yahweh, who would also in some translations be known as Jehovah, who we today call God. Okay? And the essence of it was that they emerged in the kingdom under King David, roughly around 1000 or so BC, going into 960. And over the years, their prophets began to collect their teachings, and their teachings became known into what would become the Torah, which in the Christian world is known as the Old Testament of our modern day Bible. So essentially that goes to show some of the ancient history that's surrounding that. And so I'm going to end it here and post some links along with all this. But I would also like to tell you that in the next class, we're going to talk about the Zhou Empire of China coming up tomorrow. And as with the story of Sima Khan and Sia Tian, I think you're going to find that very interesting. So remember, folks, your next test has been moved to June the 8th. So I will see you tomorrow.